means that I think now we will have people joining us. Hello, European travellers who are joining in the chat. Hello. That's it. We're live for a rail natter. That was reasonably pain-free. Hello, everyone. Hello, listeners and viewers of the show. I'm very, very... In fact, I'm delighted. I'm not just pleased. I'm delighted to say that Jon Worth is joining us. Hello, John.
Good evening.
Good evening. It's working. The sound is working. The audio levels. Anyone in the chat, if the levels are not quite right, give me a shout, and then I can fix it. But it should all be working fine. Oh my goodness. We are in for a treat this evening, everyone. It's episode 147, European Railways and the Implementation Gap. This title came pretty much directly from a blog that John wrote before Christmas, I think it was, or certainly kind of fairly towards the end of last year, which was a really nice hook that made me think. Oh, it was in December actually. It was in December at some point, I think, and it was a really nice hook into covering a lot of what you've been up to over the last year. But we shall cover that in some detail momentarily. First, as has become a weird transition, a weird tradition to transition us from the fact that the UK government no longer publishes a weekly update on ridership statistics. I'm now putting up pictures of trains related to the episode title. So, rather appropriately, on a number of levels, as we were talking about earlier, John, episode 147 means that we're back. There is no BR class 147, but there is a DB class 147, which is this slightly strange-looking machine. I believe photographed not far from you in the outskirts of Berlin. So here it is. This shed-looking thing. It's very red. It's hauling some regional double-decker coaches. It looks very nice. So there we are. Nice shout-out to the DB Class 147. Lovely. No Wikipedia page. So if there are any rail nerds out there, there's an English Wikipedia page waiting for you to write, unless it's already been absorbed into the Tracks Wikipedia page. Anyway, that's a nerd out. It is a Tracks. Yeah, thanks, John. Real John and John in the chat. This is meta and confusing for me. Right, so this episode, we are going to be talking about Europe. Not... And the definition of Europe we're going to be using is we're going to be talking about the EU, because there's got to be a limitation on scope. And John, for your cross-border rail project, which we will talk about during the episode, you focused on the EU, didn't you? So not any Eurostar. So the Eurostar crossing, for example, isn't included in that because there's lots to fix on that. But that isn't in scope, is it?
That's not in the scope.
Indeed. So we will, without further ado, because we need to introduce John properly, we need to talk about the cross-border rail project. We need to talk about what on earth the EU actually is. All of these things and more in tonight's Rail Natter. Everyone, welcome to tonight's show. As the Intercity 225 fades away, there it goes. We're left with a slightly unflattering screenshot of Mick Lynch in full flow on LBC earlier today, chatting to James O'Brien, and it was an interesting one because it was the first time someone had effectively cornered Mick Lynch on a point that. I understand his logic on it. Basically, it was James O'Brien pointing out the RMT took a pro-Brexit stance, and it's impacting on worker rights. It has the potential to massively impact on worker rights. Why did you take this position? Can you explain it? And it was actually a reasonably interesting discussion. I don't agree with Mick Lynch on the RMT's logic on this. I think it's naive, but I can see where they were coming from. And they talked. One of the things that Mick Lynch talked about was the problems being caused by the market liberalisation inherent within the fourth and indeed the previous rail packages. Indeed, the fourth rail package. And so we are going to come back round. It felt like that was today, which is brilliant, given that we were talking about this is the episode, so it feels like a good thing that we will tackle later on. But first, before we do anything like that, let us see John, who has been sat in the background very politely waiting for me to actually bloody bring him into the episode. John, hello. It's good to actually see you.
From Berlin. Hello.
So John, first of all, before we talk about the cross-border rail project, do you want to introduce yourself?
Right, so I'm relatively new to railway work. I'm basically a European Union politics nerd by background who, out of political conviction, travelled a hell of a lot by train. as a result of actually working on Brexit-related things, so I'm British and I live in Germany, I actually then started, when Brexit became too depressing, to ask myself the question, well, I need something else politically to get my teeth stuck into. And having travelled Europe-wide by train for work for many years and lots of things break down, trying to do something about improving Europe's railways seemed like a good bet to try to work on. And so that's how I come to then being working on these topics. So I've been focusing heavily on trying to solve some of the problems of Europe-wide night trains and why there are so few of them, and trying to resolve some of the problems with night train rolling stock was one of the things I worked on first. I also know a lot of people are working on ticketing Europe-wide. So why is there kind of no Skyscanner for rail or Kayak for rail kind of equivalent? And the thing I then did, which we're going to talk about mostly today, was I crossed all of the internal borders of the European Union that you can cross by train in one massive trip.
And it was massive. It was huge.
yeah, exactly. I did take a couple of small breaks in Berlin in between, because otherwise I think I would have fallen over. So that ended up being 30,000 kilometers by train and 95 borders that I crossed. I simply had to limit it somewhere, so that's why I didn't go to the UK. I also didn't go to Ireland, because Ireland has only an external EU borders, only internal EU borders. I did also add Norway and Switzerland and Liechtenstein, as well as EU countries, simply because they were easy. And so one of the things I might actually be doing in 2023 is completing the other borders, right? So Western Balkans.
That's where I get interested. As someone who goes to Serbia frequently, I'll be paying close attention to that,
Moldova, Ukraine, and so on. I simply had to limit it to somewhere. But basically, as I'm an EU politics nerd, and this problem needs to be solved by the European Union, it made sense to look at internal EU borders. And that's how the choice was then essentially made. And it all comes back to an old report which was written by a former member of the European Parliament called Michel Kramer in 2015. And he published a paper which was called Missing Links. It said, here are 15 places where basically there used to be railway lines crossing borders within the EU, and they've all fallen into disrepair. So here are some places where the European Union ought to basically put that right. And during some COVID lockdown, I was bored. I was like, oh, what happened to those 15 things that you put in this report? And ultimately, only one, a border of Bavaria to Czech Republic, Mark Dravitz to Ash in Czechia, had anything been done? And so I started asking myself the question, well, hang on a minute, well, what could be done, and indeed, would there be any hope of improving those individual connections? So his 15 projects turned into then 95 border crossings, and a whole kind of dynamic kind of started up over the past 12 months.
Absolutely,
anyway, so that's #crossborder rail. Used to be a lot on Twitter, but slightly different point. I have a bit of a falling out with the way Twitter is being run at the moment, so I'm not very active on Twitter. I'm mostly on Mastodon on #crossborder rail. But you can also find the website for the project, crossborderrail.trainsforeurope.eu.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point, because as in Blue Peter style, here is the website. It's a good website. You can drop in, crossborderrail.trainsforeurope.eu.
Which explains a bit what I did, and also, which we'll talk about now as well, out of those 95 border crossings, there were then 20 of those places I went, where there are things you could do very quickly and quite easily in order to manage to improve the cross-border railway lines. So that's a quick kind of...
So actually, I'm going to do... So there are two maps. In fact, there are three maps that we're going to have up tonight. The first is, I believe, your journey, which is this this map here, which gives an epic idea of what was happening. Spectacular.
Basically, the days alternate. There's like yellow-orange days, and the following days like blue-purple days, and every individual train has a slightly different colour. So that's what that map shows. And if it's green dotted lines, that's something else, like a ferry or a bus or something. Yeah. You can see quite a lot of unpleasant rail replacement bus services up in the Nordic countries going on there.
Yes. Oh golly. Yeah. My goodness. And then so that's a map that's brilliant fun. If anyone out there wants to repeat this process, good golly. As ever, by the way, in the chat, do at me in if you've got a question, because John and I can pick those up appropriate gaps. But the other map you've done, which is brilliant, and you said before when we were prepping this, you said this is a work in progress. So you're continuing to refine and improve this map and add bits to it.
So the research is pretty much done here. So I'm up to, so this second map, it maps every cross-border railway line there is or has ever been in Europe, right? Now, the icons determine what is there. Is it a route that's fallen into disrepair? Is it a route where there is still a track, but there are no passenger trains running? Or are there actually passenger trains running as well? And pink is all of the places I went this year. Orange is all the other places I've been. And grey are all of the ones that I'm missing. You can see I've been to something like 130, 140 borders, but I've got a hell of a lot more to do. Borders of Czech Republic and Germany there, right? Now, that's been as a result of a lot of actually a European Commission report from 2018 helped me put that together, and I've added at least 100 more out of my own research. It's basically all of the internal borders of the EU, but also UK and Ireland, Moldova, Ukraine, and all of the Balkans, right?
Yes.
So like Northern Ireland border is super depressing.
I was going to say, that's just absolutely bleak situation.
One active line there at the bottom, you can see, whereas all the others are all out of action. Anyway,
my goodness.
So if you have a look at that map and happily put it in the chat there, that there may be some borders missing. You also see around Belgium as well. Belgium had a whole bunch of cross-border tramways, for example, narrow gauge tramways in the interwar period. All of those have been kind of dismantled altogether. But basically, what I'm now going to be doing in 2023, at least, I've not quite got the format right yet, is going to some of the places I didn't manage to get to in 2022, particularly if there's something interesting there. So something that works particularly well or is particularly broken in some way.
Yeah, there's the bits that the ones that I'm always deeply frustrated by because they slow the ability for Dean and I to get across Europe are the connect. And the most recent one was we had to get the bus from Belgrade to Zagreb because the railway, the Balkans, or the Serbian authorities and the Croatian authorities just decided, we don't need a railway. We don't need to run that railway.
Yeah. And honestly, in the 27 countries I went to, the 24 EU countries and 3 others I went to this year, there are 3 EU countries where the railways are deeply, deeply broken. And they are Latvia, Romania, and Croatia in their different ways. And so it's not particularly even the Serbian side of that one. It's actually like
Croatian.
The Croatian railways are totally broken.
Yeah, and there's so this map alone could fill the episode as we could explore this, but and maybe someday we do just you can update us and perhaps that's something we could do in the future. But I'll update the description and include the link to this map because it's a brilliant little map for nerds, policy nerds, collectors, people who are partly obsessive and want to make sure they've ticked everything off. This is a fantastic map for that sort of thing. But also particularly just history as well. It's very interesting seeing the density of connections between, say, Hungary and the Balkans. There's Hungary and Austria. There's some very interesting densities of connections there, between Germany and Poland as well. There's some interesting stuff going on. So let us press on. So from the cross-border rail project, which we've got the link there for, on your blog and kind of off the back of the cross-border rail project, you wrote a piece about this implementation gap, which we've titled the episode based on. And I thought very briefly and in true rail narrative style, there's a bit of to describe what that implementation gap is, and this very much exists in the UK as well, at GB as well. So that there are lots of parallels, and to be honest, similar parallels in lots of parts of the world of this. So this isn't just a uniquely EU feature, but we're going to talk about the EU. So we have the macro element of policy intentions, right? So the aspiration, if you like, I've worded it, and that is the biggest one. The biggest macro is we know that railway transport has to be kind of, if you like, the backbone of the way we move people and things around, because otherwise we're going to burn the atmosphere off the face of the planet. Climate change. Railways are a key part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and for I think probably every EU country, transport is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's certainly the case for the Western European countries. I'm not 100% that it is for all of them, but it probably is, because for most developed countries that's the case. You've then got the problems, which are the implementation of that is the micro. So things like ticketing, online sales, timetabling, these fiddly, crunchy things that allow you to enable the macro. So actually getting to the aspiration, the micro is what enables it. So you've got this kind of path from micro to macro, from implementation to aspiration. But the challenge is that, as you pointed out, there is a disconnect. There is a disconnect between the aspiration and the implementation, between the micro and the macro. That gap there is the gap that is what you call the implementation gap, the gap in implementation. And so this is what you've explored. You've explored this through looking at the borders, where you've got reasonably tangible things like they don't run any trains, or there is a train 3 times a week, or whatever it happens to be, or you cannot buy tickets for this train from either of the national providers on either side of the border type situation. You know, some of these weird things. Some of them are more fundamental than that, and I think we'll explore some of those later on. But this, hopefully, I don't know, John, does that reasonably well summarise the implementation gap?
It's also how you kind of talk about railways and the public discussion about it, right? So if I'm being asked questions by non-railway people, they've confronted the micro problems.
Yeah.
Damn, I want to book a train from Berlin to Nantes and I can't do it. Yeah. And, oh, by the way, actually, we all ought to do it because of the climate challenge, right? And they go, but why can't politicians see this, right? Why can't politicians act on this? Why can't politicians put that right, right? And that's then the kind of the crux of that gap. Now, the answer is ultimately, theoretically, at least within one country, if these things are totally broken, you could theoretically at least vote someone else in, right, who might want to fix it. Yeah. And at least we've got a national debate about the state of our railways, right? There's the ongoing debate where I'm based in Germany about Deutsche Bahn and all of its delays and why is that, and the bridges collapsing and the trains always breaking down and so on.
Yeah.
But still, right, what is Deutsche Bahn's worst route? It is Frankfurt to Brussels, right? Frankfurt to Brussels had, in August this year, 24% of the trains cancelled, and of the trains that did run, only 49% of them were on time. Right? That is a shockingly bad number. It's much, much worse than any routes within Germany. Now, why can Deutsche Bahn get away with that? Well, it's an international route, right? It's that thing that runs to Belgium. For the Belgians, it's that thing that runs to Germany.
Yeah.
The state companies are not fully responsible. When the train breaks down on the high-speed line, which has only got international services, Infrabel in Belgium doesn't make available a rescue locomotive to haul the broken-down ICE out of the tunnel. And basically, you have what the EU Agency for Railways calls collective irresponsibility, essentially meaning no one grasps it, right? Now, that's then the point which I then say to the European Union, basically saying, hey, look, this is an international problem, it's a cross-border problem. You, European Union, are supposed to be sorting these things, fixing these things, but here clearly this isn't working. So what the hell are you doing about it? Now, then comes the problem that the European Union institutions then say to me, well, we've set up the framework to allow the railway companies to solve problems like this. But my answer then is to say, well, clearly here are the top 20 things which I'll come on to in a minute. Here are exactly the points in the European Union where it clearly isn't being fixed.
Perfect examples,
How do you bridge that gap, right? Now, I was talking to a member of the European Parliament from the Transport Committee about a cross-border railway line doesn't work, which connects the region that MEP is from to the neighbouring country. Was that MEP aware the railway line did not work? No. Right? Now, that is the depth of dysfunction. Now, I didn't really know that at the beginning, but now I've gathered such an enormous amount of knowledge about all of these places because I've been on the ground. Actually, when I then get confronted by some boring blah blah from a policymaker, yeah, of course we're pro-railways, of course we're doing the right thing for the climate challenge, I go, yeah, here on the ground this doesn't work. What are you actually practically doing in order to manage to fix it? Now, one thing, it sounds really boring, but one thing which I think the European Union ought to do is an annual cross-border railway index. That would basically be to say, and all of those cross-border lines which I've mapped, or at least the ones where there are tracks that are still in existence, is the situation at any given border getting better or worse in any given year? Because then we could start to say, hey, there is a problem. So one cross-border railway line in the EU passenger traffic ceased completely in December. That was from Mons in Belgium to Aulnoy or Aymeries in northern France. Now, then that would get a red indicator saying, hey, France and Belgium, you've got a problem. In other places where it improves, they put on new services or increase the regularity of the services. That gets a green index, and you say, okay, well done. Czechia and Germany, you've increased the regularity of your trains. We want to show that you're good.
Yeah,
right?
Showcase the good work. Yeah, exactly.
When you've got that understanding, can you begin to put those problems right? Now, what I basically discovered from this project is pretty much no EU policymakers have got that degree of understanding. Yeah. Indeed, pretty much no national policymakers have got that understanding to that degree of detail either. Now, it is a general problem, or pretty universal problem. Transport minister or transport commissioner or member of the European Parliament in the Transport Committee is not the place that ambitious politicians want to go. That is the place where you put your duffer, like Grant Shapps, no other job, or Andy Scheuer, right, in Germany, where you've got no other thing to do with them, basically. Yeah. And so that then means we are stuck with this problem that everyone is talking about wanting to put this problem right, but no one's actually really got the right answers for the solutions about what to do about it.
Yeah, it's exactly the point you make about the parallels between transport is, for some reason, even though it's, in my eyes, it's the epoxy resin that connects every other policy area together. It's absolutely critical, and yet we so often find ourselves with unambitious politicians occupying that space. It is relentless. So I think so if we come back to this then raises, right, so we've got the big, we'll go back to your top 20, as it were, of areas that are an issue in a moment. We'll come back to the fourth rail package, but even before we talk about the fourth rail package, I think we have to kind of answer the question, what is the EU? What is this pan-national organisation? How does it fit together? So, we have the EU. Everyone knows about the EU. Here it is, wonderful. But there are constituent parts of it. You also have the European Commission, the European Parliament. I just realised that this is playing the audio in perpetuum on here. So, good God, I'm gonna pause that. Good grief! Right, it's deleted. It's gone, everyone. It's gone. Yes. So.
You could also add in here as well the EU Agency for Railways.
Yes.
As well.
Where are they? Let me get
anyway,
you. So, let's all. Where are they? EU. Yes.
Right. So, in briefest terms, the European Commission is the that's high tech. The European Commission is the closest you've got to something like the government and the civil service. So you've got 25,000 officials working in the European Commission. The 27 European commissioners are something equivalent to a quasi-government. And then there is one commissioner who is responsible for transport policy. That is Adina Valian from Romania. Those 27 commissioners are then supposed to be held to account by the other EU institutions, the European Parliament, which you can elect people to, so it's 700 odd members of the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union, which is the representation of the member state. Now, the challenge with this, right, is in the same way as most laws in pretty much any country are proposed by the government. It is the European Commission's responsibility to bring forward new pieces of legislation, regulations or directives, and those then make up what you've just referred to, Gareth, as the fourth railway package. No, not the Council of Europe. That's something different altogether. The Council of the European Union. Which
Sorry,
is not
yes. I knew I was doing it, and I was like, shit,
Anyway,
I know. Council of the EU.
The
Thank
EU,
you.
exactly, yeah.
Thank
It's
you.
always an alphabet soup. Anyway, but basically, the European Commission proposes the law. It then has to be voted by the European Parliament and by the Council of the EU, where the 27 member states of the EU are sitting, their national ministers. And then when something has to happen or something has to be implemented, then it's the European Commission's responsibility, together with the EU Agency for Railways that is based in Valenciennes. Now, Let's explain in brief how that worked with regard to the fourth railway package.
Yes.
So these railway packages, which started in the early 1990s, were trying to put right a dysfunction in international rail, which still exists. Now, let's not kid ourselves that there was some kind of halcyon days of international rail in the EU. This has been broken in different ways for decades, and these railway packages were a solution to try to put it right. Now, there's lots of kind of reminiscence about the past in railways, Trans-Europa Express and so on. But actually, rail's percentage of international journeys in Europe has always, for both passengers and freight, been lower than rail's percentage of national journeys, right since throughout the post-World War II era. It's tended to be something in the region of like 15 to 20% of freight is on the rails in Germany, 15 or 20% of freight is on the rails in France, but only 8% is on the rails going between the two, and the same for passenger rail. So that was basically what the European Union was trying to solve, was basically to say, hey, look, we want to get international rail in the EU up to the same sort of level as we've got it nationally, right? Now, there are very big differences, right, of rail's market share between different European countries, but let's at least make sure that rail performs as well internationally as it does nationally. And those are what those railway packages have sought to do in their different ways. Now, that has basically been, and it's very much a kind of a 1990s economically liberal way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Let's separate out the running of the infrastructure from the operations. Now, so theoretically meaning that a German company has the opportunity to run a train into France, or a Spanish one can run a train into France, or I don't know, a Swedish one can run a train into Denmark. Now, and then the so-called technical pillar of the fourth railway package, which is actually something there's been a lot of work that's been done to give the responsibility to the EU Agency for Railways in Valenciennes for rolling stock type approvals. Basically meaning then that if you want to, you've designed a new train and you want to approve it in order for it to be able to run in more than one country, that type of approval can now be done by the EU Agency for Railways in Valenciennes rather than going to each of the national agencies or legislative authorities in order to do that. So that's the heart of it. Now, does it work? The answer is it depends where you are and who you are, right? Now, so what I very much learned from this project of the experience on the ground is not it's private good and public bad, or public good and private bad. There are good private railways in Europe and there are bad ones. There are good state-owned companies and there are bad ones. And there are better or less good ways, if you want to, of liberalising your railways. So, for example, I had an absolute nightmare in Sweden trying to plan my trip due to an absence of information in the case of there were engineering works, meaning you needed a rail replacement bus. It just didn't work. Yep. Czech Republic, for example, by contrast, has much better information provision, and that problem is solved. If you look at a route like Turin, Milan, Bologna, Florence, Rome, Naples, their EU railway liberalisation seems to have worked. You have two high-speed operators. They've driven down the costs. You've got good quality infrastructure, which is owned by the state. And in that, because basically all of Italy's main cities are all lined up in one row, that allows basically, it's something which is ideal for the sake of competition. Now, that is not going to solve you. A competitive solution is not going to solve your problem between two small towns at some forgotten border somewhere where the infrastructure is in a bad way. Yeah. There may be competitive tendering might solve you the problem, but I don't know. Now, what is very, very important before you even come to the public or the public versus private thing is what type of railway do you want? Who do you want it to serve? How often should it run? And in whose interests is this railway operation actually being organized, right? Go to Děčín, right? A small town of 40,000 people just south of Dresden in Czechia. The Eurocity from Berlin comes into Děčín every 2 hours. An intercity or a Eurocity comes from Prague every hour. Then in Děčín, small regional trains depart in all of the directions out of Děčín with a very well-organized timetable. Some of them are run by the Czech state operator Český dráhy. Some are run by private operators and are done on competitive tendering. Now, it is basically structured to say, these are the types of people, and these are the people that we want our railways to serve. And from that, we're going to work out how to organize it. Now, if that were not Decin and that were Villach in Austria instead, those trains would all go off in all of the different directions and will all be run by Austrian railways at the moment, because there's not been competitive tendering of regional rail in Austria yet. But basically, both of those models work. What doesn't work, is when you've got the worst of both of the systems. Now, the worst of both of the systems is Thalys, the high-speed operator between Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam, which is now, due to the merger with Eurostar, it's now only 80% publicly owned, right? But it's 55% SNCF, 20% SNCB from Belgium, and a little bit is still from NS in the Netherlands. It's basically still a state operator. And what it does is it makes it pretty much impossible for any other operator, be it private or another state operator, to get a path into Paris Nord station. So there's not competition like there is in Italy, but it's not doing anything which is socially orientated in terms of the pricing of that train, right? So if you take a TGV to Lille by comparison, which is only 20 minutes less ride than going to Brussels, you still can get some cheap tickets on it. On Thalys, forget it, right? Like, I paid 140 euros booking a month ahead for a single ticket from Amsterdam to Paris, right? Now, so that is the worst of both worlds. It is a publicly owned company behaving like a private monopolist.
Yeah, it's doing an impersonation of franchises as they used to exist in the UK. It's doing the worst thing, the worst possible thing.
It's grim, right? Now, so I don't care, personally, which way you go. You can go the Italian way with competition, and it seems to work if the population is dense enough and your infrastructure is good enough. Or if you want to have a publicly owned railway, you can do that too. And if you look at the way public railways work, like Austrian railways, right, under the fourth railway package, which works with a much more socially orientated way of running the railway than the UK's railways run, you can do that too. The only thing you can't now stop under the fourth railway package is basically allowing other people to try to apply for a path on your network if they want it, right? Now, in Austria, there is another operator, Westbahn, that runs predominantly from Vienna to Salzburg. And then when it comes to cross-border railways, there were two places I went where there are cross-border trains not running cross-border at the moment, but they didn't make my top 20 because change is afoot. It's northern Sweden to northern Finland, Tornio to Haparanda. There's basically 4.5 kilometers across the bridge at the border where there are only freight trains at the moment and no passenger trains. There is it's right up there, and next to Luleå. If you zoom right in, right, like there at there you can see it, Tornio, right? Yes. So you can see there's a track.
Well, actually, people have sent me pictures of that because there's a fancy bridge with some multi-gauge stuff going on. I think
like it had been pissing with rain for days from the point I got there, and suddenly the sun. It was wonderful. But anyway, they will be reactivating that one. So at the moment, you can see the black line on my own map is where I took a bike to get across. From and the other is another extraordinary place, which is in the Pyrenees, at Canfranc. So going from Pau in southwestern France, and I did go there. It's where the green dotted line is on my map. There you can see. It's very geopolitically interesting because. When I was on the Spanish side, I got talking to a train driver who drove the trains to Canfranc on the Spanish side. The line was closed due to a runaway train in the 1970s on the French side that destroyed a bridge. Anyway, this is the only France-Spain connection that doesn't go through either the Basque Country or Catalonia. And so that's the reason why it's been a priority for Spain to reopen it, is because basically it would be, if everything went south with the with regionalism or independence movements, it will be the rest of Spain's only continental connection towards the rest of Western Europe. And again, there is political support from Nouvelle-Aquitaine on the French side and Aragon on the Spanish side to reopen the line. Now, it's incredibly torturous, that route. It's super scenic, but it's never going to be a fast route between France and Spain. I didn't actually send them to you, Gareth, but there's some wonderful pictures I can also post in the chat that I took with the drone of the Canfranc border station. those were the two of the places that I went to where you basically said, okay, look, it's not running at the moment, but there is a political consensus on both sides of the border to want to improve it, to fix the problems, and things are moving forward. Now, what you had pretty much everywhere else was on one side of the border, one country wanted to fix it, but the other side didn't want to. So, for example, the future Rail Baltica route from Lithuania to Poland, on the Lithuanian side, it is impeccable. On the Polish side, it's all to shit, right? Like they've done nothing there at all. Whereas if you then go to the Poland-German border, the Polish have done all the work, but the Germans haven't, right? So you have this crazy situation where basically you've got like everyone again going like passing the responsibility back and forth to each other, and so again that would then be my answer to the kind of allegation that this is all the fault of the fourth railway package. Now, if you want an excuse, the fourth railway package can be the reason, right? You can always find an excuse for not doing something if you search hard enough. Likewise, if you actually want to act and you want to improve those cross-border connections, there are places where it is steadily improving, right? Like pretty much any border of Austria and Czechia, it's reasonable. It might not be perfect because the infrastructure is not always great, but at least it's going in the right direction. Any border to France is pretty much all going in the wrong direction, and the services are either worsening or getting cancelled. Now, that then doesn't come back to an issue from the European Union. That ultimately comes back to what is your purpose as a railway?
Yeah. So it's as with everything, the answer is there is a complicated range of options available to policymakers at national, pan-national, and indeed regional level, because obviously mainland Europe has much stronger regional government as well, so you've got to kind of factor that in. So the issue, so to kind of to compress that, there are the fourth railway package, amongst other general EU/EC/EP/C of EU policy. Would you say that it is on balance a blocker or has it been a blocker to rail progress? What in a fairly snappy summary, do you think it has or has not?
It's both.
Yeah, okay. I like that answer. That's a very rail natter answer because it's the reality.
In some places it's helped, and in other places it's hindered, and that leaves you with an outcome that's probably neutral.
Yeah. Right? Okay. Yeah. That's the perfect rail natter answer. It is both simultaneously because it's complicated and a huge number. Rail natter is all about saying things aren't linear and easy. It's a huge spider web of post-it notes, and you wiggle one and all the others jiggle around.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds about right.
Yeah. So perfect. Well, off the back of that, so that kind of helps to Richard Smith is saying that's a very EU answer. It's appropriately so. The thing is, as you pointed out, the good thing about so if we go back to the cross-border rail top 20, there are material. The top 20 is brilliant because it gives 20 material things that could be solved. So if I quickly jump to the big, we'll pick 4 examples in detail, but I thought very quickly we could actually look at the, and I had the map up earlier actually. This is the map with those, and again I'll put the link in the description. Your top 20 are here, and you can sort of look. It's quite small in the text, but you can see you've got. I can go into my labels here, and it actually allows me to see. So, for example, you've got the Vilnius to Turmantas, the kind of the missing service here in which is slap bang between Lithuania and Latvia.
So that's one. For example, until 2017, trains used to go from Vilnius to Daugavpils, which is the second city of Latvia with 100,000 inhabitants. And then the Latvians said, we're not willing to subsidize that train for the last 20 kilometers any longer. We're going to cut it back to Turmantas, which is a village of 286 inhabitants. And so I did that on my bicycle instead to go from to Turmantas. There were other people who were taking a bus on a dirt road there and were walking the final 2 kilometers across the border to then take the train onwards. Now, the train exists. It is compatible with the Latvian systems. It can run on the Latvian side. There's enough staff to run it because they sit on it. All you're talking about is a few litres of diesel. It's not an electrified line to extend that train as far as Daugavpils and run it back. You've got plenty of time. Everything is in place, right? We're talking about, I don't know how many litres of diesel you need. You're talking like 50 euros a day or something, right? In order to manage to make that work. Can they manage to make it work? No, because Latvia says, we're not subsidising Lithuanian train. The Lithuanians say, we're not going to run something that's not profitable on the Latvian side. If you're a Latvian voter, have you got a lever, right, to basically say, hey, Latvian politicians, fix this shit? No, because there are too few people living in that rural area. When I then took this one to the European Commission and said, hey, what are you doing to fix this problem between Daugavpils and Turmantas? They say, sorry, we've set the framework for this problem to be fixed. And which my answer is, well, it's not being fixed. So what are you going to do about it? And they said, sorry, we can't fix this. Now, and so again, you get like the problem gets passed round and round in circles. Now, if every politician, right, plays a kind of, we're just going to shift the responsibility onto someone else, then you're never going to get that fixed. Now, part of the difficulty also in all of the Baltic states is the nightmare, which is Rail Baltica, so the standard gauge line, which is...
Future episode on that coming, by the way, everyone. Yeah,
from Warsaw, then to Kaunas with the spur to Vilnius, onto Riga, and then to Estonia, to Tallinn. Doesn't actually go anywhere near Daugavpils, but anyway. The problem is basically everyone's going, well, we don't really have to do anything about our international rail at the moment because Rail Baltica is going to fix the lot. So the project is, however, all geopolitically motivated, and they're basically they're building this line, but they haven't actually got a proper rolling stock procurement. And Rail Baltica is going, the market will fix it. It's like, who the hell is going to take the risk on a railway line where no one knows how many people are going to be taking the trains? And you could really have a situation where actually the first bit of Rail Baltica to be completed, which will be Riga to Tallinn, will be like an island of standard gauge operation, which will have no trains running on it because no one's procured any. It's a don't get me started.
So interesting. So an interesting question actually should come through from Richard Smith, which will, and actually again from Ariane Burnt about fourth rail package, which we'll maybe go back and pick that up because I think it's worth. But let us go through the four. So you've got a variety here. You've got poor timetable, ticketing problems, missing service, poor track.
Back to the slides and I can explain the 4 cases.
Exactly. Yeah, let's do just that. So the top 20. We're picking out 4 of the top 20. Oh, by the way, this is different to when John Stone and I went through the missing high-speed rail links. That was us getting excitable with crayons about potential benefits to an overall high-speed network. This is different. We're talking about cross-border links that kind of functionally exist now, at least, or did recently and don't anymore, this sort of thing. So, of the 4 that we're going to pick out, here's the first.
So, these are one of the ones which motivated me a bit at the beginning, right? Which were basically international railway lines which had fallen into disrepair were not operable anymore, and whether it makes sense to reactivate the lines, right? Now, ultimately, many of these were a complete pain, so only one of them made it into my top 20, and that is in northern France at the border to Belgium, so between Valenciennes and Mons. Now, the important point here is that the EU's Agency for Railways is based in Valenciennes, and if you see the map at the bottom there's 2 kilometres of track which are missing at the border, right? So all of those sidings are actually an Alstom manufacturing plant on the left, which they still use to get the trains in and out once they've built them. The 2 kilometres at the border are missing, and then in Quievrain on the Belgian side, then trains run from there on to Brussels. So basically, you've got 2 kilometres of track which are missing, which if you reinstated them, you'd be able to basically connect Valenciennes, a relatively significant city in northern France, to Mons, and then on to Brussels. So at the moment, if you want to get from the EU's Agency for Railways in Valenciennes to the seat of the EU's power in Brussels, you've got to go on some crazy detour around either via Lille or via Maubeuge and Charleroi, both of which take you ages. Now, this one is very, very easy to fix. There's nothing in the way. The right of way is available. Now, if this were a border between, say, Hungary and Austria, it would have been solved years ago.
Yeah.
This being France and Belgium, it's not solved. Now, one thing that particularly nags at me, I wouldn't necessarily expect better of Macron's transport minister, Beaune, but the Belgian transport minister is from the Belgian Green Party. Now, the fact that he has so little attention to international railways makes me rather sad. Anyway, but in simplest terms, railway lines which were out of action, of all of the ones that I went to, the only one you could really semi-viably fix and made it to the top 20 was this one. So Valenciennes, Crépin, which is the border village in France, to Quievrain in Belgium. It's also quite funny that there's a phrase in Belgian or Wallonian French, which is to say outre Quievrain. It means like the end of the world. It means beyond Quievrain. And so that was
rather nicely encapsulates this one of the top 20. Yeah, very, very good.
So that's the first criterion. Basically, reactivating railway lines, it's pretty tricky, right? Yeah. Let's move to the second criterion. We've got them backwards here. That's the fourth.
Oh, sorry, that's me. Let me whiz this to the back.
We need the Green Bridge next. No,
there we go.
That one, right? No? Yeah, this one. Yeah, right. So, places where legally operable railway lines exist, but no trains run, or in some cases, freight trains run and passenger trains don't run. So that is the bridge. I'm taking the picture in Croatia, and past the barrier is Slovenia, between Metlika in Slovenia and Bubnjaci in Croatia. What happened here is the trains were cancelled at the beginning of the corona pandemic, and because up until 1st of January this year, Croatia was not in the Schengen border-free zone. They basically just put a barrier in the bridge. Right now,
you can see it. It's a bloody. They just put a bloody barbed wire fence up here
with barbed wire on top of it. Now, one of the things which I have some hope for, though it's a kind of a basket case railway, is now Croatia is in Schengen. It would then actually mean that reopening a railway line like this should be comparatively easy. So there are actually 5 cross-border railway lines from Croatia, 4 of them to Slovenia and 1 to Hungary, where the tracks all exist, but no trains or only a very limited services running, which should now all be possible to reopen those lines as a result of Croatia finally joining Schengen. So that is the situation at Metlika Bubnjaci. Now, there's an opportunity here for cross-border commuting because that area of southern Slovenia is economically relatively strong, and particularly in a town a little bit further called Novo Mesto, there's quite some strong pharmaceutical industries. So the opportunity would be to live on the Croatian side, commute by train to your job on the Slovenian side. So that was the second. There were loads of those places where you could basically relatively easily open up a passenger railway connection. There's also another Slovenian one, Nova Gorica to Gorizia, which is twin towns, Italy to Slovenia.
Gorizia and New Gorizia.
It's a wonderful place. I can highly recommend it. And this bridge was also at a wonderful spot. So those were comparatively easy. Loads of places where you basically go, or Daugavpils Turmantas, right? It's an active railway line, but with no passenger trains. So loads of those, comparatively easy to fix, right? So that's the second criterion. The third is timetable coordination. So here we are at Ventimiglia on the Mediterranean coast of France to Italy. I didn't actually manage to go via Ventimiglia in my project because there was a French railway strike, so I had to completely replan. So this is one of my Twitter followers' photo who happily let me use the photo with permission. Now, imagine you want to make a trip from Marseille in France to Genova in Italy. There are no direct long-distance trains on that route any longer, which is another problem in itself. So you have to take a regional train from Marseille to Nice, a TER from Nice to Ventimiglia, the border station as shown, and another regionale in the Italian side from Ventimiglia to Genova. Now, the problem is they've not sat down and coordinated the timetables. So when you get from Marseille to Nice, you miss the train to Ventimiglia by 5 minutes.
The worst. I hate stuff like that.
Wait, it gets worse. The next one is in 25 minutes, which isn't too bad.
Okay. That's
but that one, when it gets to the border, misses the next train from Ventimiglia to Genova by 4 minutes. And the next one is 1 hour and 56 minutes later. Right? So as a result of this lack of coordination of those 3 trains, you end up with an almost 2 hours longer trip time if you want to go from Marseille to Genova. Now, during my project, I met in Rome via a common contact the head of regional transport of Trenitalia and said, "Are you aware of the Ventimiglia timetable problem?" No idea.
Really? That's quite interesting.
Right. No, I must say, now, got lucky there via some connections in Italy. I talked to some very senior people in Trenitalia during this project. Now, there were 3 railway companies that were super open to me during this project on the state ones, right? It doesn't take a genius to guess which ones they are. Trenitalia, Český dráhy, and ÖBB in Austria, right? The places where some of this stuff actually works.
Yeah.
Reading between the lines, basically, Trenitalia is just basically pissed off with the French, finds ways of making it work really well with the Swiss and the Austrians, and the infrastructure is lousy to Slovenia, but they want to try and make it work, essentially.
Yeah.
Anyway, there are other coordination problems like that, a bunch of other borders, France, Spain, Estonia, Latvia, tons of things like that, right? Basically, where you need organizations on both sides of the border to just sit down together and work it out, yeah? You have some borders where the regional trains stop at the last station before the border on both sides and nothing runs through, right? Regional trains, right? So that's also the case between Chambéry and Bardonecchia, so the Alpine line from France to Italy as well. Yeah. So timetable coordination there, right? And the fourth then, so that's the one with the other bridge.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got certain really weird infrastructure or non-investment. So this is probably the most annoying picture I took in the entire trip. I had a drone with me, so I had sent the aerial photographs. Here, this is the Polish-German border between Zgorzelec and Görlitz. So at the top of the picture is Poland, going towards Wrocław, and there was a 2003 treaty between Germany and Poland to electrify the entire corridor from Wrocław all the way to Dresden. Poland completed its side about 5 years ago, and as a provocation towards Germany, built the electrification masts to the middle of the bridge, which is where the border is. On the left of or at the bottom of the picture is the German side, and you can see, although they've renovated the arches of the bridge, it's still only diesel. So you have this little kind of tiny DMU that just potters back and forth between Dresden and Zgorzelec because they've not got around to electrifying the line. Now, as a result of that, you could imagine, for example, if you were to run a train like Frankfurt am Main to Krakow, for example, you would run it through here. But as a result of the missing electrification on the German side, you don't want to arse around changing your locomotive from electric to diesel to electric again.
Running diesel the whole way.
Yet you don't run any long-distance services through there, or no one has yet tried.
Yeah.
So you've got situations like that in a bunch of different places where you've got the cross-border bit is like beset by the problems of decrepit infrastructure. So something runs here, yeah, but it's not in any way. Well, sorry, the service is as good as you can expect given how rubbish the infrastructure is, but you need to fix the infrastructure. Now, I hear from railway lobbyists all the time in Brussels, the EU needs to plough more money into the infrastructure, right, at cross-border connections. Now, my answer to that is yes, in some places, like here, right? Clearly, this needs to be improved.
Yeah.
But likewise, and that might have been one you discussed in the previous episode with John Stone, there is, for example, a cross-border high-speed line between France and Spain, between Perpignan and Figueras, which had, probably when you were talking to him, 4 trains a day each way, and at the moment has only 2 trains a day each way on the high-speed line. So it's completely the opposite. You've got really good infrastructure, but no trains are running there.
Which is disastrous. It's just an embarrassment to spend all that money, that impact, that environmental impact, the carbon emissions from building it, to then just leave it totally unutilized. It's appalling.
So you've got to basically answer which way round is it. Now, at a bunch of German borders, the infrastructure is knackered, but something is running, right? And a bunch of other borders in certain other places, the infrastructure is actually okay, but there's nothing running there. Now, and so that's then a bit what you have to then basically unpack. And then when railway lobbyists essentially say it's all about the quality of the infrastructure, well, I'm not so sure in all cases.
It's you know what? When I first saw this picture, it's funny that you say that this is an example of bad infrastructure. When I first saw this picture, I thought, is that a render? The track looks fantastic in that one.
Yeah, well,
but then, of course, now so the track's lovely, but yeah, you can see the masts and you can see the final anchor span there.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and Görlitz, Görlitz is a bit like that, right? It's a wonderful city. It's really charming, but there's no life there.
Really? Okay, yeah.
They've renovated all of the physical environment, but it doesn't work. Anyway, there you go.
That's so
those are 4 different groups, right? So basically, reopen tracks which have fallen into disrepair, pretty tricky. Run passenger trains on tracks that exist, but where there aren't passenger trains at the moment. Third is where there are passenger trains, actually make sure that the timetables work. And then the 4th criteria are a bunch of like weird oddities where essentially you have things like this, or there's 2.7 if you want to go from Liberec in Czechia to Zittau in Germany, the train runs 2.7 kilometers through a tiny stretch of Poland. The tracks on the German bit are 120 km/h, on the Czech bit are 120 km/h, but the maximum speed on the Polish bit is 40 km/h. Oh. Everything's knackered. Now, both the Czechs and the Germans have said to the Polish, hey, we can give you some money to improve the track, and the Polish have declined, because they say, well, actually, there's a village along the route, but no station. So why should we actually have faster trains running past our villages, right? Now, like, those types of things, when you see that, it makes you kind of mad.
Yeah, and it's not easy to just immediately wave a wand and solve those issues. The EU can only go so far to actually assert itself in those circumstances. But if it provided money at, sorry, go on, John. Yeah.
But you've got to want to do it, right?
Yeah.
You've got to basically, first of all, say, okay, look, we've got a problem. Right, we're going to sit the decision makers down on both sides of the border here at Zagorzelec and Görlitz, right? What's your problem here? Why has it not been done? Yeah. And is there anything we can do from the EU to help you fix it, right? Now, the EU is not doing that.
Yeah, that's the gap. That's the fundamental. That feels like the fundamental thread that runs through. Yeah.
Now, you might then come up against a barrier further down the kind of policy process that says, okay, there's something that doesn't work, right? I don't know, there's a problem with noise, there's a collapsing bridge, a tunnel that's too low to electrify, whatever it might be. But you haven't even got to the stage to work out what the block really is. Yeah? And then comes also the public component, which is who names and shames the politicians that balls this up?
Yeah.
Like, who is really to blame for this circumstance? Right? Now, clearly it's some politician on the German side, because they're also not respecting the treaty they signed with the Poles, right? But you have a kind of passing the responsibility around and not solving the problem, which I find quite frustrating. And one of the things which I find, and that's why I was kind of motivated to do this in the first place, is, again, we have no proper EU discussion about railway policy. We have companies, right, the operators well represented in the debate towards policymakers. We have the people that build trains that are very well represented towards the European Union. But what have we got from the side of people who actually use trains, right, particularly passengers? Now, there is the European Passengers Federation that's supposed to be a lobby association that's supposed to be working on these topics, but they're very small and very weak and can't really kind of put passengers' point of view towards the European Union institutions. Now, basically, those who lobby hardest win out. And basically, if you're a railway company, you don't really want to solve this one. Right? You're not going to make much money out of Zagorzelec Görlitz. And so that's what I'm then trying to do in as far as I can as kind of an individual campaigner. One of the things I'm wondering about is, could I even build a kind of passenger rights association that would work better? To then basically put this point of view to political decisions.
And this neatly comes to the kind of this last point, and we will come back to the questions, by the way, folks. There are a couple that we'll pull up in a minute. This comes back to exactly as kind of rounding this off, which is how we close the implementation gap. Well, there are a plethora of ways, but I like what you've talked about in creating a bit of a dashboard or almost a name and shame approach to these cross-border connections.
Well, and the EU does tons of naming and shaming and all kinds of different things, right? During the Eurozone crisis, hey, the budget deficit in this country is high, or to reform your social systems here, or your taxation systems there, right? Apply that to rail and to transport, right? Then you might start to get somewhere, yeah? Now, and then there are some other political ones, right? The future European Commissioner for Transport can't be worse than Nadina Valian, right? It'd be pretty hard to be worse. It's not that she is anti-rail, right? Like, she just is not effective, right? Yeah. She was Romania's second choice to be commissioner and didn't really, it's not like she's working in someone else's interest. She's just not seizing political opportunities. Yeah. So there might be a bit of an opportunity that from 2024, someone after Valian might be a little bit of an improvement. We can at least hope.
That sounds a little bit like there's so a weak minister or a weak elected representative can be bolstered by having a strong civil service around them. So is that because the office of the commissioner is quite a weak? Would that help? Would a strengthening or bolstering of that office help?
It would help, but again, it's the Directorate General, which is like your kind of ministry basically in the European Commission, is, I would say, it's not a particularly motivated or a motivating place to work, right? It doesn't have the best reputation within the Commission as the place where if you're an ambitious official, you'd really want to go. A person that's worth keeping an eye out for from there is the Director for Land Transport, a Danish chap called Christian Schmidt. Probably for those who don't like the Fourth Railway Package, very economically neoliberal, but at least a sharp mind.
Yeah.
So if there's anyone who's really trying to make some of this stuff work, and also he is reading between the lines, at least annoyed by the reticence of the railway companies to act. And there is another thing which is afoot in the EU, although this opens a completely different topics. But anyway, is that as a result of the inadequacy of the Transport Commissioner, Adina Valian, the Vice President of the European Commission responsible for the EU's entire climate change policy, a Dutch politician, Frans Timmermans, has started to talk a bit about railways, probably as a result of the annoyance with inactivity from Valian. So he said, for example, if the railway companies don't put the ticketing problems right, so the inability to book through tickets and the danger that if you've got multiple tickets, you can get left stranded somewhere. Yep. If railway companies don't put that right, then we will legislate to make sure we put it right. Yeah? The fact that he was willing to say that, for example, says to me that there is a tension within the European Commission between the climate change people and they want better from the transport people.
Yeah, that's interesting because when that happened in the UK, the organisation that preceded the Department for DEC, the Environment, Energy, Climate Change, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, they just got disbanded.
Oh no, that's not going to happen here.
No, and you could argue that the climate change, the DG climate change, the element of the European Union's government organisation that manages climate change is only becoming more powerful, which is a good thing. That's a good thing.
Exactly. So now, what's probably going to happen is they're going to come forward with forgive me because I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but the so-called MDMS regulation. If someone in the chat can correct me what the title of the what that actually stands for. Anyway, basically, it will be the rules on multimodal ticketing, which basically will clarify who has to give what data under what terms to each other if you want to book a train plus a bus plus a plane ticket. Yeah, there is a new piece of legislation coming forward called the MDMS regulation, which is supposed to sort that out in the middle of 2023. Now, what will happen probably is the Commission will come forward with a decent draft. The European Parliament will go, this is fine, we can live with this. And then member states of the European Union, heavily lobbied by their state monopolist railway companies like PKP in Poland, will basically fill it the whole thing and nothing good will come of it. Because that's what happened on railway passenger rights a couple of years ago. The Commission draft was okay, the European Parliament was solid, and the member states said, well, international railway stuff is not our prime concern. Actually, we don't want the trade unions on our backs from the state-run railways, and they don't sell many international tickets anyway, so sod that. Now, that's a bit the difficulty which may well happen with these ticketing points as well. It's not through lack of ambition from the climate change people around Timmermans and the Commission.
I see. Okay, so I think that kind of neatly... I think we've done a reasonable job there of kind of picking out some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities. I think it's a nice one that we've ended there on the fact that there is a strength of political will from the climate change side, if not from the transport side. One of my complaints about the EU as a whole has always been that it spends a lot of capital, both money and energy, political energy, on building big roads everywhere. Whenever you take a train, often you will see an enormous road being carved along while you're riding on haggard old infrastructure, which is deeply, deeply frustrating.
But there's also a point that the member states of the European Union can get money from the EU to finance railway projects if they want to, right? But it comes from the member states up to the EU to a large extent, right? Now, the EU is not as good at going to those member states saying, hey, you're building too many roads. Yeah?
Yeah.
And so it's got to go. Now, again, that's the nature of the beast of the European Union, right?
People would get very unhappy if the European Union suddenly had the power to stop people building roads. That would make member states very unhappy.
Exactly. Yeah.
As we've seen, living here as I do in a former member state. So, what we're going to do very briefly, I'm going to go to our two large faces and answer a couple of questions, if I may.
Yes.
And indeed, so we'll answer a couple now, and then send more questions, and we'll answer them at the very end.
Yeah.
So, the question I want to answer is, and it's a bit of a technical. Oh, crikey, it's miles up here. It was from, where was it? It was a very good question, but I've lost it because we've had a few good questions. Basically, it was on the fourth rail package. What materially is the fourth rail package from a legislative perspective? Is it a series of laws?
Yeah.
Is it a series of principles with laws behind them? What is materially the fourth rail package?
So it is a series of laws, but those laws then oblige member states to change their behavior in certain ways, right? So, for example, on approval of new rolling stock, it has obliged those member states to say, actually, above your national authority to approve the rolling stock, there is now another authority that can essentially impose new rolling stock on you, right? Now, that actually came to a head because the Danes just buggered that up when they wanted to try to run a new night train from Stockholm to Hamburg. The Danes actually not so-called implemented the fourth railway package correctly in their national legislation, right? So basically, you had the situation where you had, I won't go into all the technical details of it, but essentially, the Swedes said, it's fine if Valenciennes does it. The Germans said, it's fine if Valenciennes does it. And the Danes didn't have a mechanism to say, either it's okay that Valenciennes can do it, and they hadn't got their own mechanism to approve it. Anyway, so now what then happens, right? Now, again, we're back to the implementation gap. Theoretically, the European Commission can investigate a country that's not implemented it correctly, and then bring that country to the European Court of Justice and fine them for non-implementation. Now, there's a big hoo-ha about this in the political debate, because I see some people even posting about it in the chat. There is the Private Railway Companies Lobby Association, All Rail, which has basically been complaining like hell all the time when some countries have been carrying on giving one kind of central concession. So the Dutch have just given a concession to NS to keep on running the central national Dutch railway network, right? Now, I don't want to get into that argument about whether NS should get a direct award or not for the national operations. That's not my business of how, and indeed, probably it shouldn't be the EU's business necessarily, right?
Yeah.
But the difficulty comes, and this is where the rub comes in the fourth railway package, which is still not really fully answered, right? Is imagine you're then a non-Dutch provider and you want a path, right? Now, there is a process to allocate you the path. How much is going to cost you? How much is going to cost you to access the station that you need on your path? But maybe the Dutch have instituted a path allocation process which is only 1 year long. But somewhere else you want to run the train, that allocate you a path for 3 years. So then you don't actually know for the subsequent years, you're going to get that path on the other side of the border. You've then got, within the rules, you've got like the French, for example, which you could do what you could call a reverse Ryanair, right? So they basically price their emptiest stations the most expensive. And they price their full stations the cheapest. As for the full stations, it's full. You can't run any trains here, rival, Flix train. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, Paris de Litz, where nothing runs, there's plenty of capacity. Oh, yeah, 920 euros per train. Yeah, it costs you 10 euros to run a train into Vienna Hauptbahnhof. Now,
it's the opposite way around it should be.
Right, but now, so you have the situation, right? The EU basically says, so in each railway package, the first one says, right, by law, you need to separate infrastructure from from operations. The second one, you've done that, but then you realise actually they're all colluding with each other still to make sure you keep competitors out. So then you say, okay, you need greater financial separation, which comes in the second railway package, and then there's the obligation to do that. And the third one says, okay, well then you need transparency of your allocation of your paths on your network, because actually we, the European Commission, have heard that the rival from across the border can't get a path. Okay, you've got the transparency of the paths. Then you've got the situation, it's like, hang on a minute, everyone's allocating paths according to different rules, so as to mean that actually you get 3 years allocation of path on one side of the border and 1 year allocation on the other side. Or it doesn't work between the allocation of the paths or the allocation of the station charges. So in the fifth railway package, we'll try and put that one right.
Yeah.
And so what you've basically got is a kind of a cycle, right? So you try and work out what is or is not working. Have you put the problem right? Until then you say, hang on a minute, we haven't put that problem right. And then comes around the next piece of legislation to try to put the next problem right. Now, and the difficulty then comes is our public understanding of how that works is really, really poor. So I keep on hearing all the time, yeah, but the fourth railway package has made type approvals for rolling stock Europe-wide just too damned hard. It's too hard to do. The Hungarians have managed, right? So MÁV has its so-called Intercity Plus program, 200 kilometers an hour Eurocity carriages, built in their own workshops as a kind of like in Szolnok, as a kind of job creation scheme in a poor city in Hungary. And they've got the carriages approved for 7 different countries under the rules of the fourth railway package, right? Now, if the Hungarian State Railways own manufacturing workshops in Szolnok can sort it out that the carriages can manage to be approved, right? And you're then telling me that Alstom can't actually approved to run to the first station across the border. Like, someone's not telling the whole truth here. But the problem is as an outsider to this process, trying to work out what the whole truth even is very, very difficult. Because again, the railway press will just basically regurgitate to a large extent what the railway industry tells them, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And someone in my shoes as a campaigner, I can learn as much about the technical details as I possibly can, right? But I've never personally done a rolling stock approval. Now, so out of that, right, there are people who can solve these problems, yeah? But my ultimate conclusion is you need the political will to want to solve them first, before you come to an operator, right? And that then is, so I've got a bit off the topic of exactly what the fourth railway.
No, but I think that neatly lays it out, yeah.
Of European Union law, which regulates some powers the European Union got us directly and places some legal obligations on the member states of the European Union to themselves change their behaviour.
Yeah, and I think that neatly kind of goes into Richard Smith's question off the back of that, which is, does EU law, do the various rail packages prevent the subsidy of cross-border services and only allow regional services for domestic trade, regional subsidy for domestic trains?
Sort of, right? Now, okay. So there is no such thing as an EU-wide public service obligation, right? So you can say, basically, this is the service we want. Actually, this is the difference between how much it would cost and what we get from the ticket price. We will award a subsidy for the operation of that train, right? Which is how regional services work in most European countries. There is no such thing as a cross-border one, right? Now, what you can do if you've got good politics on both sides of the border is you do a, like Berlin-Brandenburg to Poland, for example. There are loads of regional trains which are subsidized this way. Berlin-Brandenburg subsidizes them on the German bit, and the Polish region subsidizes them on the Polish bit, because the two regions sat down together and worked out how to do it, right? Now, there is this misnomer in European rail, which comes from the Swedes, the Danes, and the Belgians, which say the whole reason why night trains from Scandinavia to Central Europe don't work is because the Germans don't give public service obligation contracts for long-distance trains, right? It's literally not possible in German law. Now, ultimately, that's true, but the argument is bullshit. The reason night trains couldn't be run from Sweden to Germany was no one had any night trains, right? There are companies which are open access operators that succeeded in running night trains at the relatively low level there is if you run at 200 kilometers an hour lower on the German network, right? Now, That is a problem potentially in Germany. Maybe there might be some corners of the country that you might be able to cover with a long-distance service if you subsidised it, right? But among the very long list of problems and dysfunctions with railways in Germany, that you can't do PSO contracts for German long-distance trains, in my view, ranks comparatively low. And you can definitely do regional train, right, public service obligation contracts. So, like, you can fix that if you've got the right political will. Now, maybe you should medium-term be able to allocate a PSO contract Europe-wide and do some kind of Europe-wide tendering, maybe. But the problem is not insurmountable if your politicians want to surmount it.
And I think this comes to a bit of a core thing that I think I've talked about a lot in terms of GB and UK transport policy problems, which is that one of the core problems is the lack of core aspiration of what's the question? What is the actual question? Or rather, take a corridor. You have what is the modal share there is now currently between air, road, rail? What is the aspirational split of rail, of road, of air? How do you get between them? Yeah. That feels like an EU level question. So forget where the borders sit. You get a corridor. You go right, Paris to Berlin. That's a corridor. These are the modal shares. We want the climate change element, again, as we say, says they want this modal share. That then allows you to determine what the required policy objectives are to provide that. And that doesn't happen. That doesn't exist. And it feels like the EU could play a bigger role in that broad brush stuff.
It would importantly, it has the legal framework and the powers in the treaties to do that if the legal power exists, right? Now, there are some things that the European Union has tried to solve in the past, things like levels of corporation tax, where it's fallen foul of not having the legal power in the EU's treaties to literally do it the way it wanted to do it. In all of railway policy, that is not the problem. There is the formal legal power for the European Union to do that sort of thing. This is not legal as a problem. This is political as a problem. Right? You have to convince those countries and their national railway operators to want to be able to act. So it's very, very important. You can solve the legal problem if you want.
That's a key. In a way, that's a really key one for us. Everyone, hello, everyone in the chat. By the way, I'm loving how many people from Pan-European Train Twitter are here. Hello, hello, all of you. That feels like a core thing. Is that the EU has the power to talk about mode share on corridors, and that would then essentially set the shape.
There is a point in the chat which is correct. So there is a modal share regulation for the corridors for freight under 10T, right? So Trans-European Networks transport corridors, which is correct, right? But the problem is not the modal share on 10T networks, is the slow implementation. So the European Commission is really, really sluggish and making sure that when there are gaps in 10T, right? Germany's been saying it's going to 4-track Mannheim to Basel for God knows how many years and still hasn't, right? So the problem is that there is no legal consequence for not doing the changes necessary under 10T, right? So that's why you then can't actually... So on Richard Smith's point, is 10T actually meaningful? The answer is yes, it is meaningful, right? At least because if your line is 10T, the EU has more financial means at its disposal to be able to improve the infrastructure. But again, only if the country in whose territory the line is really wants to do it. Now, at the border, right, I went to one, it's a really complicated project. Germany, the line Freiburg, Breisach, Volgesheim, Colmar, so Alsace to Baden-Württemberg, right? Germany wants that as a 10T comprehensive network line. Now, the bridge across the Rhine was bombed in World War II. In the 50s, the railway bridge was replaced by a road bridge on the old foundations of the railway bridge. And today, you'd either have to build a new road bridge and put the railway back, or build a new railway. And there's a hydroelectric power station there, and it's a total mess. Anyway, but Germany wants this in 10T, and France doesn't. Right, so you're like, are we going to put it in or not? Right.
Yeah.
So the answer in principle, however, though, right, is what Will Deakin's comment in the chat, right? The 10T program was established by the European Commission to support the construction, upgrade, transport infrastructure. Yes, right, but again, you've got to make sure what is the Commission telling the member states what to do, and what is the member states actually then asking for money from the Commission, right?
Yeah.
And so there are lines, for example, one which I've been driving every German railway nerd mad is northeastern Bavaria, the border to Czechia. So basically everything around Hof, Nuremberg, Hof to Cheb and across through Fürth im Wald. Basically, there are 3 lines there which are both dual track diesel lines, which also have some freight and have an international significance for Nuremberg, Pilsen, Prague, and Munich, Prague. Right? Now, half of those tracks are 10T, but Germany's going, we don't think in our national calculation that electrifying them makes sense.
No.
Right? Now, let's not get into an argument about what does or does not make sense for electrification. But Germany's saying, in our national view, it doesn't make sense. Whereas actually, for 10T purposes, it makes complete sense. Yeah. Right? So you've got the policy purposes clashing. Now, is the European Commission going, hey, Germany, you have a commitment to make sure that you electrify, I can't remember which bit it is, but like Nuremberg, Bayreuth, Marktredwitz or something. They have a commitment to electrify, right? Is the Commission putting the finger where it hurts and saying, hey, Germany, you've actually got to do this, right? Regardless of what you're now saying in your national debate.
But the challenge is that they don't, without that broad modal shift by a certain date target, there's nothing really to hold anyone accountable for when the 10T upgrade is exactly as you just said. Without that target of we need to drive the modal shift so that we bring the GHGs down, without saying this has to happen by 2040 or by this date, there's none of that pressure to
right.
And to keep it. So it feels like there is a bit of a single thing to push the EU and its various elements. There is we need to see explicit targets for modal shift away from polluting modes. So there's definitely some, usefully some sort of potential positive messages. Anyone, all of those listening from the DG, from the EU, from Allrail, from the European Commission and the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. There you go. You have a thing to do. Right. We're going to attempt to pick up some more questions in a minute, but I shall push us through the outro. As ever, this has been a podcast that I think will work quite nicely in audio format, unlike many of the others. Available on all good podcasting platforms. Hello to those listening in audio only form. As ever, the plugs: PayPal.me/Gareth Ennis for loose change and abuse. The YouTube chat, which has been extensive. Hello everyone who's new in the YouTube chat. The Discord server is where this continues, and and this sort of subject it bounces around in perpetuum because it's very interesting stuff. GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord. And if you want to support this happening and get the occasional goodie and allow me to just do RailNatter, particularly this coming year when it's the year of the baby, patreon.com/Gareth Ennis to support me on Patreon. Thanks everyone who does that. John's blog. John, your blog is full of all sorts of interesting stuff. Lots of transport stuff coming up in there, but also lots of, from people who remember from many years ago, you did a lot of very interesting policy stuff related to Brexit and related to the functioning of the EU and its elements. But the most recent one you did, which was good enough that, ironically, I was DMing you on Twitter about this and then only realised when I jumped onto Mastodon to find you that the reason you weren't picking up my DMs is because of this blog in 2 ways. I was saying I can't access your other blog, it's not loading. It's because so many people went in to read this blog, it crashed your blog. So, which is fine, it's good. It was about, this one is about Twitter. I might not agree that people should leave Twitter, but I agree with a lot of what you're saying about it. I suppose my view is that Mastodon is also not necessarily owned perfectly either and whatever, but it's a good blog, go read it. It's certainly food for thought on the mess that is Twitter. The good thing, of course, about Twitter being owned by Musk is that Musk is posting like he's never posted before, and everyone is realizing he's a nitwit, which is, that for me feels like a positive reason for the website to burn. But also it can't completely die, because if it does, Elon Musk will be walking backwards out of a Saudi embassy at some point before the end of the year. So it'll endure. He will not. Anyway, so there you go. So John's blog is jonworth.eu. A very nice blog address. I'm jealous of that one, actually. That's very nice indeed. Lovely. Jonworth.eu. Go to John's blog. Anything else you want to plug, actually, John, while I have you here?
Don't think so. I think that's all.
Perfect. Go to the blog. Follow John on Mastodon. Don't follow John on Twitter for now, because he's not doing anything on there. But he might come back. And of course, next week's episode of Rail Natter is, I suppose potentially a continuation, but actually it's every asterisk way that the Railways Act 1993 resulted in today's mess. It's a fairly nice, neat number since 1993, given that it's 2023. I just submitted a piece to the IPPR's journal called Progressive Review, which is basically a potted history of UK railway privatisation. And weirdly enough, it becomes quite a neat narrative that explains everything that's screwed up right now. So I will go through that in the episode. That is next week. Everyone, you can see. Hello. Oh, yeah, that's a good point, John. I should have asked you what you're drinking, and you're reporting in the chat that you're not drinking anything.
No. The glass is empty here.
So, John, that has been exhaustive and has covered all sorts of things. Hopefully it's satisfied everyone in the chat that you've got lots of bits and pieces. Everyone in the chat, that's been brilliant. Lots of really good stuff in there. But John, honestly, that's been a brilliant episode. I've enjoyed that thoroughly. That's great.
And thank you for the invite.
No, an absolute pleasure. I think we've covered all. I don't think really any other questions have popped up in the chat. Actually, I feel like we've kind of covered it quite nicely. Actually, there we go. Yeah, everyone's just talking about Mastodon now. Fine, right. Let's draw a line under it because we've gone at 24 minutes long. John, have a good rest of the evening. Everyone in the chat, you enjoy yourselves. And from us at Rail Natter Towers, cheerio, cheerio.